Okay, let's travel back in time, almost 200 years, to a peace treaty signed in a little village in Burma. It brought a brutal war to an end, but that's not where its story ends, not even close. In fact, the echoes of the Treaty of Yandaboo are still a powerful force in political movements happening right now.
So that's the big question, right? How could a piece of paper, signed way back in 1826 between two empires, become the bedrock for a modern call for independence? It's a really fascinating and honestly a crucial link between the past and our present.
And look, this isn't just some vague historical connection. As this quote makes crystal clear, for certain groups, this treaty isn't just dusty old history. It's basically Exhibit A. They point to it as the legal and historical starting point for their entire argument, that Assam's sovereignty was stolen.
So to really get why this document casts such a long shadow, we have to go back to the beginning. Let's pull back the curtain on the world of the 1820s and see what was going on that led to this treaty in the first place.
All right, so picture this. It's the early 19th century, right on the eastern frontier of British India. You've got two incredibly powerful, expanding empires, and they're about to find out that this part of the world just isn't big enough for the both of them.
On one side, you've got the super ambitious Khanbaung dynasty of Burma. They're pushing west, they've conquered Assam, and they see the British as a major threat. And on the other side, you have the British East India Company, trying to lock down its borders and trade routes and getting seriously alarmed by how fast the Burmese are expanding right onto its doorstep. They were on an absolute geopolitical collision course.
The final spark came from some clashes over small territories and islands. But honestly, the writing had been on the wall for years. By March 5, 1824, it was official. The First Anglo-Burmese War was on.
Now, the British probably thought this would be a quick win, but what they got was something else entirely. This conflict would go down as the longest and most expensive war in the entire history of British India, and that staggering cost is going to directly shape the peace that follows.
For almost 2 full years, these two empires were locked in this just brutal conflict. The Burmese forces were tough, they were battle-hardened, and they knew the jungle terrain inside and out, which turned out to be a massive problem for the European troops. The human cost, just for the British side, was immense. We're talking around 15,000 European and Indian soldiers who lost their lives. But what's truly shocking is how they died.
Think about that for a second. This wasn't just a war against another army. It was a war against the environment itself. A staggering 70% of the European deaths weren't from bullets or blades, but from tropical diseases. The conditions were just brutal.
And the financial cost? A jaw-dropping £13 million sterling. To put that in perspective, that is well over £1 billion in today's money. This war was financially ruinous, and it triggered a severe economic crisis back in British India. Remember this number, because it totally explains the British mindset when they started talking peace.
So, with their army exhausted and their treasury hemorrhaging money, you can bet the British were determined to make the Burmese pay for every single penny and every single life lost. This led them to impose some incredibly harsh terms when they finally forced the issue. And here it is, the Treaty of Yandaboo itself. It was signed on February 24, 1826, with British forces camped just 50 miles from the Burmese capital. The Burmese were completely cornered. They had absolutely no choice but to accept whatever the British put in front of them.
So what did the British want? Well, it boils down to 4 key demands. First, Burma had to give up huge chunks of land. Second, they had to pay a massive indemnity, £1 million. Third, they had to promise to stop meddling in neighboring states. And fourth, they had to accept a British diplomat in their royal court.
The amount of land they lost was just immense. The Burmese were forced to hand over Assam, Manipur, Arakan, and the Tenasserim coast. It was a complete dismemberment of their Western empire. And it's that very first name on the list, Assam, where the seed of this modern grievance gets planted. And this, right here, is the crucial point. The treaty talks about the Principality of Assam, because at the time, Burma controlled it. But Assam wasn't a signatory. They weren't at the negotiating table. Their people had no representative, no voice, no say at all in their own future. Their fate was being decided for them by 2 foreign powers.
The consequences of this treaty were immediate, and they were devastating. Not just for the losers, but in many ways for the winners, too.
For the Burmese Empire, this was a total crushing humiliation. It bankrupted their treasury and really marked the beginning of the end of their independence. But for the British, it was what you'd call a costly victory. Sure, they got a ton of territory, but the financial crisis it created was so bad that the powerful East India Company actually lost its trade monopoly with China because of it.
And for Assam, the outcome couldn't have been more definitive. The Treaty of Yandaboo brought the 600-year-long rule of the Ahom kingdom to a sudden, unceremonious end. Just like that, a centuries-old independent kingdom was wiped off the map and Assam was absorbed into British India.
So, how does all of this connect to today? This is where we tie all those threads together, the war, the treaty, the transfer of territory, and see how they're woven into the fabric of a modern political grievance.
So let's break down the heart of the argument. The grievance really stems from these key points. Assam was annexed without its people's consent. This action ended a kingdom that had existed for 6 centuries. For many, this treaty is seen as the exact moment Assam's sovereignty was lost. And it's this powerful historical narrative that's used to justify modern calls for self-determination.
And that really leaves us with the two competing views that define this whole debate today. On one hand, you could see this as a pretty standard, if harsh, colonial-era treaty between two empires, just a relic of a different time. But on the other hand, it can be seen as the illegitimate, unjust theft of a nation's sovereignty, an act whose consequences are still very much unresolved.
Which brings us to our final question, and it's really the core tension of this whole story. When does an event like this stop being just a fact in a history book and become the living foundation for a modern political right? Now that is something to think about.